In this lesson, we're going to animate our graph using trim paths. We'll also be animating our numbers and the dots for the graph using a user-created animation preset. Okay, so we're right here where we left off with our text animating out of frame, and now I want to bring on the graph. Now I want to do this in a separate comp because we're going to be using a camera. So as you learned in this composition back here with our 3D camera, it just was a little bit easier to deal with in its own composition. So come over here to your project panel and hit your create a new composition button, and we'll call this comp, let's call it line graph animation. Go ahead and say OK. And then let's just get this set up similarly to our other one. We need that background layer, so unlock that in my main Coral comp, hit Control C to copy it, and we'll come over to our line graph animation and paste that. And then we need to drop that line graph animation comp onto our main comp here, just at the top. And I want this to appear, I'll turn this off for a minute, right about the time that this starts to move out. So we want this to start right here on the current time indicator. So I'll turn that back on, and I'm just going to hit the open bracket key to scoot that layer all the way to my current time indicator. So that saves me time and not just having to drag it over. Okay, so now let's go into that composition and we can start our animation. So just double click in here. And we need to have our line graph. So let's go over to infographic split, and let's see here. We want to use the line graph that we had available. Sometimes if you get this problem where it starts scrolling or buffering that, you can just hit caps lock really quickly. And then if you zoom in and out, sometimes it'll bring it back. So right now, it's not doing a live update. So sometimes that's just kind of helpful. So I selected all of that. We'll hit Control C to copy. Then let's go back into our line graph animation comp and we'll hit Control V to paste. And then we need to turn back off caps lock because now it needs to be able to look at those layers. Okay, so let's just move those up into the middle of the composition. Just like that. I'm going to turn on all the switches I need, so that's going to be continuously rasterize, motion blur, and we're going to use a 3D camera, so I need my 3D switch. And let's go ahead and add a camera to this, just kind of we'll just do it right now. We probably won't get to be able to animate the camera in this lesson because it's going to take a while just to set up some of the other stuff we'll be doing, but we can get it in here, and that way we don't have to scale up our layers to make them fit this comp. We can just zoom in with the camera. Make sure it's a one node camera, and then we'll just bring up the position of that camera by hitting the P key, and then we can just drag this value to zoom in. Now it looks like it needs to take a second just to readjust, so I'm going to pause it until this stops buffering. Okay, so let's just drag this value, and that's going to zoom in on that. And we need to kind of reposition this just so it's in the middle. I'm going to go back down here to the bottom. Let's lock that pale orange solid. Select these and just kind of move that back. Having that title action safe grid on is just a lifesaver. It really, really helps just to tell where the middle of everything is. Okay, so that's looking pretty good, and our camera is nice and zoomed in. So now what I want to do is animate my line graph. So let's come down here and find that. That's going to be this layer right here. And to be able to animate it to use trim paths, we need it to be a shape layer in After Effects. So we'll convert that over to a shape layer. I'm just going to pull this up. We'll right click that and choose Create Shapes from Vector Layer. And then it automatically turns that eyeball off on that layer, so we'll just delete that layer. We don't need it anymore. And it also puts the shape layer at the very top. So now let's toggle that down and add trim paths. So we'll go ahead and hit that fly out. Trim paths is about 5 from the bottom. And we'll open this up. Now you can see that if I just start scrubbing this value, the paths animate in a slightly strange way. So they don't look like they're connected. And that's not what I'm wanting. I'm wanting it to animate from the left and go all the way across to the right. So let's go ahead and fix this by changing this from simultaneously to individually. And normally this would have the opposite effect. If you change it to individually, those little lines would do what they were doing earlier, but it's just the way that this layer was set up in Illustrator that causes it to happen. So sometimes if you're having an issue like that where it's not looking the way you want, you can try changing that and that will usually fix it for you. So now when I scrub this, you can see it's one continuously line moving across, but it's moving in the wrong direction. I want it to start back here in 1989 and move through to 2013. So what we need to do is crank up that start value all the way to 100. And then when this is at 100 for our end value, the graph is going to be starting over here. So now you can see as I scrub that down to 0 for the end value, that'll take us all the way through to the end. So let's start this at 100% for our end value, and we'll just begin right there on the very first frame. So let's set a keyframe. And then I want to move through to about the point where he starts to talk about kind of something that's going on over here. He says that there was an only a worry increase of 52% to 58%, and that's only a 6% difference. And just to be able to figure out where exactly he says that, let's go ahead and bring in our audio clip to this comp because we can't really hear it in here without bringing that in. So we'll go back out to our main Coral infographic. And we started that comp just right here at this point. So let's go back down to the coral reefs.wave. We'll hit Control D to copy it, then hit Alt open bracket to trim it to begin at the same point that our main composition does. And now we pulled this back to the beginning, so it just snapped into place. Then we'll hit Control X to cut it. And we'll just go back up to that line graph animation comp, double click it to go inside, and hit Control V to paste the audio. And the audio pastes right there at the beginning where it's supposed to start. And this is a really good way of knowing that your audio is going to line up exactly the way that it should on with what's being said on the outside, which is where that sound will come from later on. So let's go back out to the main Coral infographic and turn off that sound switch just to make sure that we don't accidentally double up on our audio later on if we forget to turn it off inside here. So now we're ready to start animating our numbers and our dots. So I'm going to start with just our first number, 63%, and I want this to scale up just right here from the beginning. So let's go ahead and hit the S key to bring that up. And I just want this to be a simple scale up animation from 0 to 100. So I set a keyframe at 100, pulled it forward, then we'll take this down to 0, and let's just have this animation happen over about 6 frames. So I'll just move forward 6 frames, and we'll pull this back here, and then let's move backwards 2 frames, and we'll say that we want it to be at about 110% there. So we'll get a nice little recoil. You can see how that goes back down. And let's go ahead and make these easy ease. So select all your keys, go up to Animation, Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease. Now, I could go through and copy and paste all of these keyframes, but that could be kind of time consuming. So what I'm going to do instead is create a user preset, just an animation preset, that we can use for anything else that we want to scale up from 0 to 100 with a 110% recoil. So we'll just select all of our keyframes, go up to Animation, Save Animation Preset, and we'll call this one Recoil. Or let's call it Scale Recoil. Go ahead and save that. And now anytime we want to use it, we can just drop it onto the layer. So that's just going to make it a lot more simple. So now we need to figure out the timing of when we want the rest of these to pop on. So first, we probably need to finish up animating that line graph. So let's go back up to the top where that line graph is sitting. And I'm just going to scrub through holding Control to hear the audio that we put in place.
It does appear that worry about global warming is on the rise, but only 6%.
Okay, so right when he talks about the 6%, that's where we want the line graph animation to be finished.
It's on the rise.
So right about here. So if it's at this point, let's just go ahead and set a marker. Don't have anything selected. We're going to do it right on our timeline. We'll hit the asterisk key on our number pad. And now we know this is the amount of time we have to work with to animate this line graph. And at that point, once we start animating our camera, I want my camera to be fully zoomed back from all my numbers, all my lines, everything. So let's come over here and take this down to 0. So that's going to animate on over that amount of time. But about halfway through is kind of where I want it to start going faster. And I want this beginning part to be a little bit more slow because this is where our camera is going to be zooming into the numbers to follow along with them. And that's going to be really, really jumpy if the line is moving that fast. So let's just say that the camera is only going to follow through to that 50% value. And so we'll just set another keyframe here. That's at 77.5. And then we'll just pull that kind of to the middle. So we have a little bit slower line animation here. And then it'll go much faster through to the end. Okay, so now that we have the timing of our line fixed, we're ready to animate our numbers and the rest of our dots. And we can use our preset to do that. So let's just go ahead and we'll type in scale recoil, no spaces. And I just want to use the page down key to start going forward and following that line. So right about here, we'll do it for 57. So let's come down here to 57. That's going to be right there. We can just grab the scale recoil preset and drop it on. And let's hit the U key. And that'll just reveal those keyframes for us. We can trim that layer to that point. So that'll just give us a better visual representation of when that's going to begin. Okay, so as I'm working, I'm going to do the dots as well. I want them to coincide with the numbers. Now, you may say, why don't you just parent them? But that can cause problems with the anchor point placement of things, and then the dots can kind of start to pop on from the side. So we will be adding keyframes to both the dots and the numbers. So let's just go ahead and start skipping through this. Just grab that scale recoil, drop it on our first dot. And then both of those will pop up at the same time. Come up here to our this number right here. That's going to be our second dot, so we can trim it by hitting Alt, open bracket, and then just drop that same scale recoil onto the dot. And let's move forward. And right when it comes to that dot, we're ready to set another one. So I'll just pull that forward right there. Drop on scale recoil. Well, let's go up to 62, crop that in, and drop on the preset. So you can see how this is really pretty easy. Just by scrubbing forward, you're able to see right where these need to happen. And by doing the dots and the numbers at the same time, you can start to work pretty fast, especially when you have a preset. Then you don't have to copy and paste keyframes. It's just clicking and dragging. Now it's going to start speeding up, so these are going to get a lot closer together. And I'm just trimming them so it's easier to tell what goes where. Okay, so I'm just continuing to work through this. And just so that you don't have to watch me do this for all the rest of these, you pretty much get the idea of trimming the layer and dropping on the preset. so that the number pops on at the same time as the dot. So in between lessons, I'm going to go back in and finish up the animation for the dots and the numbers, and then we'll come back in our next lesson and we'll animate our camera with those dots and numbers, and also with the lines. So that's just going to add to the visual interest of everything just by making this feel a little more dynamic with that camera movement. So we'll learn how to do that in our next lesson.